The chandeliers of Ashbourne Hall burned like captured constellations above 1,000 glittering eyes. The air was perfumed with lilac and champagne, and beneath the steady hum of the orchestra rose a quieter, sharper music, whispers, laughter, judgment. The Duke's annual spring ball was the height of the season, and everyone present knew that the evening was not merely a celebration but a marketplace. Alliances would be bartered, titles courted, and fortunes exchanged behind the veil of waltzes and smiles. Into this bright and merciless light entered the Hargreaves family, ambitious, adorned, and trembling with hope. At their center stood Miss Clara Hargreaves, 22, her beauty as deliberate as her mother's schemes. She was a vision of pale silk and powdered grace, every curl and ribbon arranged to enchant. Behind her, half-shadowed and walking a step too slow, followed her elder sister, Eleanor, 24, dressed in a gown of faded lavender, her gloves ink-stained where she had forgotten herself earlier that afternoon over a book of poetry. Where Clara glittered, Eleanor absorbed the room's brightness and turned it into quiet thought. Their mother's fan snapped softly, directing her daughters like soldiers onto a battlefield of expectation. "Smile, Eleanor," she murmured without turning her head. "At least pretend to wish to be seen." Eleanor obeyed, though her smile trembled. She had no illusions. In this room, she was not meant to dazzle but to decorate, to make her sister's light seem brighter by contrast. The Duke of Ashbourne stood near the head of the marble staircase, tall and severe, his expression unreadable beneath the golden light. He was a man whose restraint was legend, his manners impeccable, his passions whispered about but never proven. His recent return from the continent had set society aflutter, for rumor declared him ready to marry. The Hargreaves had fixed their sights upon him with ruthless precision, and Clara, radiant and confident, was the chosen bait. When the Duke descended, the crowd parted as though guided by instinct. Clara's curtsy was perfection, her voice a melody crafted for admiration. Eleanor followed suit, awkwardly lowering her eyes, determined not to trip on her hem. The Duke inclined his head to their mother, exchanged polite banalities with Clara, and then, quite unexpectedly, looked at Eleanor. It was not the gaze of a man smitten, nor even intrigued, but of someone briefly startled by a reflection he did not anticipate. His eyes lingered long enough for her to feel both seen and examined. She flushed, then looked away. He said nothing. Clara continued to speak, unaware or perhaps unwilling to notice that the Duke's attention had wavered for a heartbeat in favor of the sister no one spoke of. The evening unfolded as evenings in such houses always did, predictably, splendidly, and cruelly. Dancers floated through waltzes like elegant machinery, every smile rehearsed. Eleanor found refuge near the edges of the ballroom, where the servants refilled glasses and the orchestra's sounds softened into melancholy. She pretended to admire the artwork, though in truth she watched the Duke. There was a loneliness about him that unsettled her, a kind of practiced detachment that reminded her of the characters she read about in her novels, men cursed with inheritance and expectation. When her mother's voice summoned her to join a dance, Eleanor obeyed, though her partner, a forgettable young baron, seemed more interested in glancing over her shoulder at Clara than speaking to her. Midway through the waltz, a passing servant stumbled, and a glass of red wine toppled across Eleanor's gown. The crowd's murmur sharpened instantly. She froze, crimson spreading over lavender silk like a wound. "Good heavens, Miss Hargreaves!" someone gasped. Her partner stepped back, disgust disguised as concern. Clara's eyes widened in horror from across the floor, as if the shame might stain her as well. Laughter rippled through the assembly, a stifled, poisonous sound. Before Eleanor could flee, the Duke appeared beside her. His expression held no amusement, only calm precision. He removed a white handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "One should not fear clumsy moments, Miss Hargreaves," he said. "They are often the most honest." The words struck her harder than the humiliation had. He did not smile, but something softened in his eyes, perhaps pity, perhaps understanding. She took the handkerchief, murmured her thanks, and left the floor before the whispers could thicken. Behind her, she heard Clara's voice, brittle with forced laughter, redirecting the room's attention. In the withdrawing room, Eleanor pressed the stained handkerchief to her gown, trembling. The scent of his cologne, cedar, faint and restrained, clung to the fabric. She felt a foolish, shameful warmth in her chest, the kind of romantic foolishness she mocked in books. She folded the handkerchief carefully, as though it were evidence of something both dangerous and precious. When she returned to her family, her mother hissed in dismay. "You might have ruined everything. Go stand near the musicians and keep silent." Clara, radiant once more beside her admirers, barely spared her a glance. "Truly, Ellie," she whispered with a smile meant to charm others, "even your accidents demand attention." Eleanor obeyed, her pride bruised but intact. She stood at the far end of the ballroom where few eyes turned, content to disappear. Yet now and again she felt the Duke's gaze settle upon her, measured, unreadable. Once, as she looked back, their eyes met across the expanse of glittering faces. She could not tell if it was curiosity or mere politeness that drew him, but the connection, fleeting as a heartbeat, left her breathless. When the clock struck midnight and the final waltz began, Eleanor watched Clara glide into the Duke's arms. The sight was expected, even rehearsed, yet it unsettled her. Their steps were perfect, their movements symmetrical, but there was no warmth between them, only obligation. Clara smiled for the room, not for him. The Duke's expression remained unchanged, his attention drifting for the briefest instant toward the quiet sister by the wall. Eleanor turned away before he could catch her watching. She felt foolish again, like a spectator at a play whose script had already been written without her name. And yet, as the dance ended and the applause began, she found herself wondering whether the Duke of Ashbourne, a man sculpted by restraint, ever tired of perfection. Outside, the night rain began to fall, soft as applause against the glass. As the guests departed beneath umbrellas and torchlight, Eleanor lingered by the window, watching carriages vanish into the mist. She still held the handkerchief, its whiteness dimmed by the wine's shadow. A token of mortification, perhaps, but also of something else she could not yet name. By morning, the story would spread across London. The Duke of Ashbourne, they would say, had pitied the plain Hargreaves girl. Pity, such an ugly, fragile word. But for Eleanor, who had long been invisible, even pity was a form of notice. And for the Duke, who had thought himself immune to surprise, that single act of kindness would prove the first crack in a life built entirely on control. The gardens of Ashbourne Manor were a theatre of midsummer bloom, where roses tangled over stone balustrades and fountains whispered like confidantes. The Duke's invitation had arrived 2 weeks after the infamous ball, gilded and formal, addressed not to Eleanor directly but to her family. Lady Hargreaves had declared it proof that Clara's conquest was assured. Yet Eleanor, when she read the embossed seal, had felt something colder and stranger stir within her, a quiet dread that the man who had pitied her might see her again and remember only her humiliation. The day of the garden fete dawned bright and golden, the kind of weather that made London's vanities shimmer like glass. The carriages rolled up the long drive, polished wheels cutting through the gravel with the rhythm of expectation. Clara stepped down first, flawless in pale pink satin, every curl obedient to her mother's ambition. Eleanor followed, her gown of soft blue modest and unadorned save for a ribbon at her waist. The contrast between the sisters was a living painting, one made to dazzle, the other to vanish. The Duke greeted them with formal grace, his bow impeccable, his expression composed. To Clara, he offered courteous warmth, to Eleanor, a nod that lingered an instant too long. If she had not been watching him closely, she might have believed it accidental. But there was something in his eyes, thoughtful, restrained, that unsettled her composure. She returned his gaze only briefly before lowering her eyes to the ground, where the hem of her gown brushed against the grass. The guests dispersed among the gardens, laughter drifting between hedges trimmed into impossible perfection. Eleanor sought refuge by the pond where lilies floated like white crowns. She traced their reflection in the water, her mind adrift, when a voice spoke behind her. "They are beautiful only because they need not compete," said the Duke quietly. She turned, startled. He stood a few paces away, hands clasped behind his back, his tone neither flirtatious nor commanding, but curious, as if he had stumbled into her solitude by accident and decided to stay. "Your Grace," she murmured, dipping her head. He glanced toward the pond. "I wondered if you had forgiven me for the other evening." "There was nothing to forgive," she replied, though her cheeks warmed at the memory. "Only a moment of misfortune." "And yet," he said, "you bore it with more dignity than most would manage." Eleanor hesitated. "Dignity is a poor shield, Your Grace. It keeps the world at bay, but it leaves one very much alone." He regarded her for a long moment. "Then perhaps I envy your solitude," he said softly. "Mine has always been too crowded with expectation." The words lingered between them, fragile as mist. A breeze carried the scent of roses, and she wondered whether he had meant to speak so personally or whether she had imagined intimacy where there was only idle reflection. Before she could reply, a voice called the Duke's name from across the lawn. He inclined his head and withdrew, leaving Eleanor to the sound of water and her own unsettled thoughts. Later that afternoon, the guests gathered for refreshments beneath the marble gazebo. Clara sat near the Duke, her laughter bright and effortless. Eleanor remained with the older ladies, speaking little, her attention drawn against her will toward the man who had haunted her thoughts since that night. When a servant approached her discreetly and handed her a small folded paper, her breath caught. The handwriting upon it was elegant, unmistakably his. Inside, a single sketch, unfinished but unmistakable, of the lily pond, and beneath it, a line written in deliberate script, "Ink stains fade, words do not." Her heart trembled. It was a message only she could understand, an echo of their conversation. She slipped the paper into her glove, pulse fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. But secrecy is a fragile thing, and in houses such as these, whispers are a form of currency. That evening, as the sun softened into gold, Eleanor stood by the terrace railing, unaware that the folded paper had slipped from her glove to the marble floor. Moments later, Clara's laughter stilled. She had seen the sketch, retrieved it, and in an instant recognized the hand. Her mother's eyes narrowed as she glanced between her daughters and the Duke across the terrace. "What is that?" she demanded. Clara's voice, sugar wrapped around fury, trembled just enough to sound wounded. "A gift, Mama," she said, "though clearly not meant for me." The Duke, realizing too late what had transpired, crossed the terrace with measured calm. "It was no gift," he said, voice even. "Merely a drawing misplaced." Lady Hargreaves held the sketch like a weapon. "A misplaced drawing," she repeated sharply, "of my daughter's likeness?" Eleanor's breath caught. She had not even noticed that the faint outline of a figure near the pond, sketched loosely, tentatively, bore her posture, her gown. Gasps rustled through the gathered guests like the rustle of silk. "I am told," one lady whispered behind her fan, "that the Duke favors peculiar company." Eleanor's humiliation returned with brutal clarity, but before she could speak, the Duke's voice cut through the murmurs. "You may burn my paper," he said, eyes fixed on Lady Hargreaves, "but not the truth upon it." The declaration hung in the air, shocking in its boldness. Lady Hargreaves flushed crimson. "And what truth would that be, Your Grace?" "That I draw what interests me," he said evenly, "and I am rarely interested in perfection." There was no laughter then, only a stunned, heavy silence. Clara's composure faltered, and Eleanor, desperate to end the spectacle, stepped forward. "Please," she whispered, "let it rest. No harm was meant." But the harm had already been done. The sketch, now crumpled in her mother's hand, would feed the gossips for weeks. Clara's fury burned through her carefully painted calm, and when they returned home that evening, her words were sharper than the wind outside. "You have ruined me," she hissed. "You with your books and your pity and your plain face." Eleanor said nothing. In her room, she unfolded the surviving corner of the sketch the Duke had given her earlier, the line about ink and permanence. She stared at it until her vision blurred. She should have felt shame, perhaps even fear. But beneath the ache, there was something unexpected, a pulse of life, of recognition. Someone had seen her, not for her family's ambitions, not as an ornament to be ignored, but as herself. As night settled over Ashbourne, she stepped to the window. Below, in the dark gardens, a lone figure crossed the gravel path toward the stables. The Duke paused beneath her window, glanced up briefly, and tipped his hat before vanishing into shadow. The gesture was small, fleeting, and yet it altered the air around her. For the first time, Eleanor did not feel invisible. She pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection pale and trembling beside the night's reflection of stars. Whatever came next, Scandal, silence, or exile, she knew the story of her life had already turned. The storm had come without warning, sweeping across the Ashbourne estate with wind like a living thing, slashing rain against the windows and silencing even the servants' chatter. Within the vast house, candles trembled in their sconces, throwing restless shadows over portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow the commotion. Eleanor sat in the drawing-room beside her mother and sister, their evening visit stretched thin by polite silence. Lady Hargreaves busied herself with embroidery, though her thread tangled from irritation. Clara stared into the fire, her beauty sharp under the flickering light, her temper sharper still. When the Duke's butler entered with a bow and a message, the room stiffened. "His Grace requests the presence of Miss Eleanor in the library," the man said. The words hung like smoke. Lady Hargreaves looked up slowly, disbelief narrowing her gaze. Clara's needle snapped between her fingers. "The library," their mother repeated. "At this hour?" "The Duke wishes to speak privately," the butler replied with professional neutrality. Eleanor's breath caught. Her mother's expression darkened with unspoken fury, but propriety chained her tongue. "Go, then," she said tightly. "Do not make a spectacle of hesitation." Eleanor rose, smoothing her plain muslin gown with trembling hands. The storm's howl followed her down the corridor, the air heavy with the scent of extinguished candles. The library door loomed ahead, its brass handle cool beneath her fingers. She paused, her reflection faint in the polished wood, ink-stained, uncertain, caught between duty and desire, and then she entered. The Duke stood by the window, the lamplight painting one half of his face in gold and the other in shadow. The fire crackled low, a subdued heartbeat in the vast room. Books lined the walls like silent witnesses, and between them, the scent of rain seeped in through the cracks of the old stone. "Miss Hargreaves," he said, turning, "forgive the hour. I thought it best we speak plainly." Her pulse quickened. "If this concerns the sketch, Your Grace, I assure you—" "It concerns more than that," he interrupted, his tone measured but softened by something near regret. "I owe you an explanation, and perhaps an apology." She hesitated before approaching the fire. "You owe me nothing, sir. Society has its sport. I am accustomed to it." He studied her face, the honesty there, the restraint. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely the tragedy. You speak of cruelty as though it were weather, something to be endured, not resisted." Her composure faltered. "And what would resistance serve? I have neither title nor fortune to defend myself. I exist only in the shadow of those who do." He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to the length of a breath. "And yet you speak with a courage most would envy." Eleanor turned toward the fire, afraid to meet his gaze. "You mistake endurance for courage, Your Grace. They are not the same." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps not. But one often hides within the other." The rain hammered harder against the glass, drowning the silence that followed. He moved to the mantel, resting one gloved hand upon it. "When I was abroad," he said, his voice low, "I believed solitude was strength. I cultivated distance as one might polish armor. But lately I find it has rusted me instead." She looked at him then, truly looked, at the weight in his eyes, the weariness of a man obeying expectations that no longer fit. "You are not as cold as you pretend," she said softly. "No," he admitted. "Nor are you as invisible as they pretend." The words struck her like a touch. Her throat tightened. "Then we are both poorly understood," she whispered. He studied her for a moment longer, then turned toward the shelves and drew out a small leather-bound book. "You left this in the garden weeks ago," he said. "It is a volume of Cooper. I confess I kept it." She took it from his hands, recognizing her initials faintly inked on the first page. "Why?" He hesitated, and when he spoke, his voice was almost reverent. "Because it reminded me that sincerity still exists." Their eyes met, his steady, hers uncertain, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken unfolded. The air between them shifted from civility to confession, from accident to choice. Eleanor's fingers brushed his as she took the book, and the contact jolted through her like a chord struck on a harp. The Duke's composure wavered. "Eleanor," he said softly, testing the sound of her name for the first time, "I have lived my life surrounded by beauty that cost nothing to the beholder and everything to those forced to maintain it. But you—" he stopped, struggling for precision. "You make no effort to please, and therefore you please without effort." She stepped back, trembling. "You must not say such things, Your Grace." "Must not," he repeated, almost bitterly. "How many truths die by that command?" Her voice shook. "You are promised elsewhere, or so the world believes." "The world believes many convenient lies," he said. "It believes my heart is marble and my intentions mechanical. I will not let it script my future." The storm's fury rattled the panes. The room felt suspended outside of time, its silence filled with the ache of words that could not be retracted. Eleanor held his gaze, torn between terror and wonder. "What is it you want of me?" she asked. He took a slow step forward. "Honesty." Her breath trembled. "Then you must hear mine. I cannot be the woman society demands of you. I have no dowry, no polish. Only a heart too easily bruised." "Then it matches mine," he said simply. Lightning split the sky, illuminating them both in white brilliance. For one reckless heartbeat, the distance vanished. His hand rose, hesitated, and then touched hers, barely, reverently, as though the gesture itself might break some sacred law. "If I were not a duke," he murmured, "I would ask for your hand this instant." She swallowed hard, the air thick with unspoken feeling. "Then ask me," she whispered, "when you are only a man." The words hung in the charged silence, neither a rejection nor an invitation but a test of truth. The Duke's jaw tightened, as though her defiance had both wounded and awakened him. He inclined his head slowly. "Then I shall strive to be only that." A moment later, a servant's knock shattered the spell. The Duke turned away, his voice steady once more. "You should return before questions arise." Eleanor gathered her composure and curtsied, though her pulse still thundered in her ears. "Good night, Your Grace." As she reached the doorway, his voice stopped her. "Miss Hargreaves," he said, and when she looked back, he was standing near the fire, the lamplight trembling behind him. "Do not let them convince you that gentleness is weakness. The world needs more of what you are." Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. She only nodded once and stepped into the corridor, where the storm's echo trailed her footsteps. When she reached her chamber, she found the book of poetry still warm in her hands, the Duke's touch imprinted on the cover like a secret. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, carrying with it the promise of consequence. Somewhere in the darkness, a man who had lived his life by duty stared into the flames and knew, perhaps for the first time, what defiance felt like. Rain swept across the moors that morning, a pale veil over the rising mist that curled like smoke around the Duke's ancestral estate. The world seemed suspended, between winter and spring, between silence and confession. Inside Ashbourne Hall, candlelight flickered upon 1,000 mirrors, yet none could reflect the turmoil held behind the Duke's calm eyes. Edmund had spent sleepless nights replaying that fateful evening in the library, the touch of Eliza's trembling hand, the unspoken vow that had settled in the air between them. He had crossed every line of decorum and reason, and now the ripples of that moment threatened to become a storm. The season had turned restless. London's gossip papers, ever hungry for scandal, began whispering of a certain young lady's unusual attention from a certain duke. Eliza felt the weight of it before she even saw the printed words. In drawing-rooms and corridors, fans snapped shut when she entered. Conversations dropped to silence, then resumed with falsely sweet laughter. Her mother's face, once painted with social ambition, grew stiff with dread. "You have no idea what you've done," Mrs. Hargreaves hissed one morning, thrusting the crumpled society column toward her. "A duke may flirt, Eliza, but he marries a lady of standing, of beauty. Not one who hides in corners with her ink-stained fingers." Eliza's voice faltered. "I never sought." "You sought notice the moment you opened your mouth in his presence," her mother cut sharply. "Do you wish to ruin your sister's prospects? To stain this family's name?" That evening, as the wind howled against the windows, Eliza retreated to the library, the only sanctuary left to her. She moved through the aisles of books as though among old friends, her heart aching with quiet rebellion. She could still recall the way Edmund had looked at her that night, not as a conquest, not as pity, but as though he truly saw her. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and impossible. But fate, ever a mischievous conspirator, was not content to let their story fade into rumor. Days later, an invitation arrived, Lord and Lady Pembroke's spring masquerade. It was whispered that the Duke of Ashbourne would attend, and that he would, at last, make his intentions known to society. For whom, none could say. The night of the ball unfurled in a haze of golden light and murmured anticipation. The great chandeliers dripped with crystal, the air thick with perfume and expectation. Eliza had not intended to go. Yet her sister insisted, radiant in silver satin, declaring that appearances must be maintained. So Eliza went, reluctantly, quietly, dressed in pale blue silk that her maid insisted softened her seriousness. A mask of ivory lace hid her face, and with it, she prayed, the turmoil of her heart. When Edmund entered the ballroom, the crowd parted instinctively. He cut a figure of restrained elegance, his dark attire unmarred by ornament. Eyes followed him as though waiting for a cue. Every young lady held her breath, every mother's mind raced with schemes. Yet his gaze, unyielding, searched the sea of faces for only one. He found her near the terrace doors, alone as always, the faint light catching in the pale threads of her mask. For a moment he hesitated, his duty whispering in one ear, his heart in the other. Then, breaking the spell of decorum, he crossed the marble floor toward her. "Miss Hargreaves," he greeted softly. His voice carried an intimacy that belied the distance between them. She turned, startled. "Your Grace, you should not." "Should not what?" His tone, though measured, was edged with frustration. "Speak to the only person in this room with whom I can be honest." Her eyes darted to the watching crowd. "You do yourself no favors," she whispered. "And yet I find I no longer care for favors," he murmured, stepping closer. "Tell me, Eliza, have I imagined what passed between us that night?" Her lips parted, then pressed shut. She wanted to deny it, to protect them both from ruin. But her voice betrayed her. "You have not imagined it." In that instant, the world seemed to tilt. The orchestra's waltz faded to a distant hum. Edmund's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch, unseen but felt like lightning. But before another word could pass, her sister appeared beside them, her smile brittle with suspicion. "Your Grace," she greeted sweetly, taking his arm. "Do come join us for the next dance." Eliza stepped back, her heart breaking in silence as the Duke was led away, bound by the expectations of a watching world. Later that night, when the music softened and the moon rose over the gardens, Eliza slipped outside, seeking air, or perhaps escape. The scent of jasmine and rain mingled as she wandered toward the fountain's edge, her mask now forgotten in her hand. She was alone, or so she thought. "I knew you would come here," a voice said behind her. She turned. Edmund stood there, his expression unguarded, stripped of all formality. The damp wind tugged at his hair, and for once, he looked almost human, tired, tormented. "Why do you torment yourself so?" she whispered. "You have a duty. You must marry where it serves your name." He shook his head slowly. "I have lived for duty all my life, Eliza. But the only time I have felt alive was in your company." She stepped back, trembling. "You speak folly, Your Grace. If anyone saw us—" "Let them," he said quietly. "Let them write their columns. Let them whisper their poison. I would rather endure their scorn than live another day without you." Tears blurred her vision. "And yet you will," she said, forcing her voice steady. "Because you must. Because the world you inhabit will not forgive what your heart desires." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, without a word, he removed the signet ring from his hand, the emblem of his house, and pressed it into her palm. "Then keep this," he said, "so that some part of me may remain beyond their reach." She stared at the ring, cold and heavy with meaning. "Edmund." but he was already stepping away, swallowed by the dark. When she finally returned inside, the crowd's chatter had grown feverish. A hush fell as the Duke re-entered the ballroom, this time with Lady Margaret Hargreaves on his arm. The announcement came swiftly. The Duke of Ashbourne was to be betrothed to the Hargreaves' eldest daughter. Eliza stood frozen beneath the chandelier's glow, the ring hidden in her closed fist. Around her, applause thundered like judgment. The season's greatest match had been secured. Yet as the Duke's eyes flickered briefly toward her across the room, haunted, defiant, and full of things unsaid, Eliza knew that no alliance of titles could silence the truth that bound them. Outside, the rain began again, washing the guilt from the night, as if heaven itself wept for what love had dared to defy. The morning of the wedding dawned pale and uncertain, as though the heavens themselves hesitated to bless what society had already decreed. The bells of St. James tolled through a veil of fog, summoning London's finest to witness the union that promised to bind two powerful families, the Duke of Ashbourne and Lady Margaret Hargreaves. Coaches lined the street in regal procession, their wheels glistening from a night of rain, while the city's gossipmongers whispered that never had a match been so advantageous, nor a groom so unreadable. Inside the church, sunlight pierced the stained-glass windows in fractured hues, spilling crimson and gold across the aisle where Margaret stood radiant, every curl and pearl arranged to perfection. Her smile was poised, rehearsed, unshakable. Yet beneath that smile flickered something colder, a certainty that this union was not born of affection but of ambition fulfilled. She had won her title, and she would wield it well. Eliza sat in the back pew, her presence a concession to family obligation. Her gown was modest, her gloved hands folded tightly around a small locket that hid the Duke's signet ring, the forbidden token he had pressed into her palm weeks before. She had not seen him since that night, but she had read his silence as clearly as any letter. He had chosen duty as he must. Still, as the organ swelled and the congregation rose, her heart betrayed her, thundering with a hope she dared not name. The Duke entered with measured steps, his face the mask of nobility perfected by generations before him. His eyes, however, betrayed no joy. He paused at the altar, his gaze unfocused, as though walking through a dream from which he longed to wake. The murmurs around him faded into a dull roar, every detail blurred, the scent of lilies, the rustle of silk, the murmur of clergy. Only when the priest spoke his name did he stir, his eyes flickering, not to his bride, but to the shadowed pews where Eliza sat motionless. Their eyes met for an instant, and in that fragile exchange, the illusion shattered. Everything that had been suppressed, the longing, the guilt, the ache of what might have been, flooded back with merciless clarity. For the first time in years, the Duke of Ashbourne felt unworthy of his own title. He was a man of honor, yet his honor had cost him the only truth he had ever known. "Do you, Edmund Charles Ashbourne, take this woman?" The priest's voice broke against the silence. Edmund's reply faltered. A tremor passed through him, visible enough to stir whispers. Lady Margaret's smile stiffened, her fingers tightened around his hand like a command. In that pause, a single heartbeat stretched into eternity. Eliza rose. It was not a conscious act, but the silent reflex of a heart refusing to hide any longer. She turned toward the door, determined to slip away before her courage failed. But her movement drew eyes, and in that moment, Edmund saw what his future would become if he spoke the word yes, a lifetime of quiet lies and empty halls. "Forgive me," he said suddenly, his voice low but firm, echoing through the church. A ripple spread through the congregation. The priest blinked in confusion. "I cannot," the Duke continued, every syllable deliberate, final. "I cannot make this vow." A gasp tore through the crowd. Margaret stepped back, her composure cracking into fury. "You would humiliate me before London," she hissed under her breath. "I would rather humiliate myself than live a falsehood," he answered quietly. Then, turning from the altar, he walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing like thunder through marble and scandal alike. The nobles rose, torn between shock and fascination, as the Duke of Ashbourne passed them without a glance. His gaze fixed only on one figure, Eliza, standing frozen near the door, tears glimmering unshed in her eyes. "Edmund," she whispered as he approached, her voice trembling. "You cannot. This will destroy you." He smiled faintly, the first real smile she had ever seen from him. "Then let it. For I would rather be ruined with truth than crowned with deceit." Outside, the city's noise erupted around them, bells still tolling, carriages halting mid-street, crowds craning to witness the scandal unfold. The Duke took Eliza's hand, unloved now, unhidden. Together, they stepped into the grey morning, leaving behind a world gilded in false virtue. The rain began to fall again, soft at first, then steady, as if the heavens wept in relief. By nightfall, London's salons buzzed with the story. Some claimed the Duke had lost his wits, others whispered of a love too reckless for its age. The Hargreaves' name was dragged through every parlor, their social standing teetering between mockery and pity. Yet in a quiet cottage miles from Mayfair, far from chandeliers and gossip, Edmund and Eliza sat by a modest hearth. The Duke's coat hung to dry, her ink-stained fingers curled around his. "You will regret this," she murmured. "The world will not forgive." "The world," he said softly, "has never loved me as you do." She laughed, a small, uncertain sound that trembled into warmth. "You have traded a throne of marble for a chair by the fire." He met her gaze, unflinching. "Then may this fire burn longer than any crown could shine." Their lives did not vanish into storybook ease. The following months brought exile from London's social circles, forfeited invitations, and the slow unraveling of fortune that came from defying one's class. Yet they found something far rarer than approval: peace. She wrote while he worked the land that had once seemed beneath his notice. At dusk, they would walk the fields where the mist rolled low and the stars rose pure, unjudging. Years later, when the Duke's name was spoken again in drawing-rooms, it was with a curious reverence, not for scandal, but for the strange nobility of a man who had chosen love over legacy. His story became a whispered lesson among the young debutantes who once measured worth in jewels and titles, that even in England's most gilded age, there were still men who could see beyond beauty, and women whose hearts were strong enough to be chosen. And as for Eliza, history would forget her face but not her defiance. Her books, published under a modest pseudonym, would find readers who recognized in her words the quiet rebellion of a soul that had once refused to bow. In the final years of their life, the Duke of Ashbourne was seen often in the garden, reading aloud beneath the lilac trees, his voice softened by time and love. Those who passed by spoke of a woman beside him, gray-haired but radiant, her laughter still bright against the fading light. They said that when he died, she placed the old signet ring upon his folded hands before the coffin closed. His emblem returned at last to the man who had given it freely. And though London's bells did not toll for him as they once had, the wind that swept through Ashbourne's hills that day carried with it something purer than glory, an echo of the words that had defied an empire. "I would rather be ruined with truth than crowned with deceit." And so their story ended, not in scandal, but in quiet immortality. For love, when it dares to choose honesty over splendor, leaves behind no ruin at all, only legend.